this is like a convention for people who are either interested in the radio or have worked within the field of radio. Okay. So, according to Larry Miller in a 2017 study, AM/FM radio is in the midst of a massive drop-off as a music discovery tool by younger generations, dropping by 50% between 2005 and 2016. Now, these numbers sound very scary to those of us working within the industry, but they don't spell out doomsday for us. They are actually just part of a long history of the radio, and that is transition. The radio is often within transition. And in fact, we have to, as people who are working within the radio, as radio personalities, or just working within the industry itself, we have to be able to adapt to transition within the field. Now, I have worked both on air with, like as a radio personality, or behind the scenes at multiple stations for a number of years, and I've also conducted research deep within the topic of radio, its history, and the transitions that it's gone through. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the transition that radio has gone through. Then I will talk about how there's been changes in listenership in modern day. Then finally I will tell you about how your stations, or you as a radio personality, can adapt to these changes and continue to make your station relevant. So first I'll talk a little bit about the history of radio and tell you how it has kind of changed and evolved. Radio has gone through multiple changes since its initial conception. As PBS.org says, in the 1930s, it was primarily just a source of entertainment, often playing things like soap operas, news, multiple radio shows, or even just popular music at the time. But it continued to evolve over the ages. In the 40s and 50s, it remained primarily an entertainment source, but then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, FM radio began on the rise, and so radio began to focus more on the music side. But during the 80s, radio saw a big influence through this music. In fact, DJs had a lot of influence on what could be broadcasted out to people. They had different genres that they could select from that their stations could focus on. Radio was making a lot of money, so people had more creative freedom to work within, so they could have more varying content. And radio stations were popping up all over the country, so then again, they had more creative freedom to work within. But radio is about to enter another stage of transition in 1996 with the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This act eliminated a cap on nationwide station ownership and increased the number of stations one entity could own in a single market. So basically, it removed how many stations that one corporation or person or entity could own at a time, and this significantly changed the radio industry as a whole. For example, now only about 10 parent companies can control the radio spectrum, radio listenership, and revenues that radio can experience. It's basically an oligopoly where 28 of 30 music formats, only 4 companies control about 50% of the listenership. So because of this act, radio has actually become more restricted in what it can play, broadcast, and how you can work within the system. So now that we've talked about a little bit of the history and we've seen how it's kind of changed over time, let's examine how listenership is changing in today's society. There's been a significant change in numbers of who's listening to the radio, and this is largely due to online internet radio stations and personal music stations that people can play. According to Statistica.com, there are over 60 million paid users using Spotify right now. And according to Miller's report again, AM and FM radio has fallen behind by about 50% of young people discovering new music, with YouTube leading it with over 80% of young people using it, followed then behind by Spotify with 59% of younger users, and Pandora with 53% of users. And how people can access radio has also gone through a transitional phase. Usually you would think, oh, when I get in the car, I'll listen to the radio. And most cars still do have radios, but newer cars that are being manufactured are having more digital components put into them, like wireless and Bluetooth. So now instead of getting into the car and having your radio as the only option, people have CDs that they can listen to, they can plug their iPhones in there. Basically, they have more options besides the radio to listen to. And in their homes, it's following the same trend. People can plug their phones into like a stereo or have Bluetooth playing or use an internet radio to play music instead of relying on the radio like they might have done in the past. So because of these technological advancements, radio is seeing and listenership are seeing a kind of transitional phase in how people are listening to it. So now that we've talked about how technology and listenership has changed, let's talk about how we can keep up with these changes. How can we as radio personalities or people within the industry stay relevant through this transition? Well, there are two major ways. The first way is to take your station online. Embrace the internet. Make sure your programs are available for people to listen to online. For example, The Cave, a local Springfield radio station, has a lot of their programming available online. They have their shows you can listen to. They have a streaming service so you can listen to what's being played on the radio. You can make requests on their website, and you can see what's already been played within the hour. So they make it basically so even if you don't have access to a radio, you can still listen to their station. By using the internet, you can make yourself available to a wider audience and keep the people who already like listening to the radio happy, and maybe even bring in some new viewers. Because in fact, there are even websites dedicated to listing all of stations within a local area. So if you're already online, people will be able to find your station. And so they can have easy access to what you're putting out there. The second way is to keep it available to the community. One thing that radio has always done is had a large community focus in where they are stationed. So as long as you are keeping that in mind, you're still going to have that strong backbone even through transitional phases. Like I said, radio has always given information about the community, and it still does to this day, and it's important to keep it in mind. So for example, I'll use The Cave again. They'll have school closings, they'll give traffic updates, and they'll give weather reports. Basically, by keeping the community in mind and having your local listeners in mind, you're giving them a reason to listen to your station and have a backbone for your station of listeners. So, radio will always be an integral part of the United States and people listening. It's just been so part of our culture for so long. I don't think people really want to give it up, but during transitional phases, I feel like people sometimes forget about it. So it's important that we understand why the radio is going through transitions and how we can adapt to those transitions. So I talked about how radio transitioned throughout the ages, how because of how acts like the Telecommunications Act of 1996 changed the way that radio could operate. I talked about how listenership has changed through advances in technology and generational gaps. And I also talked about how to stay relevant by keeping a focus on your community and by embracing the technology. And so like I said, the radio will always play a large part in people's lives, but it's our job that we shouldn't just expect everyone to come to them. We have to give everyone a reason to want to listen to the radio. Thank you.